Funny how a single question can expose everyone in the room except the man it was meant to embarrass. Malcolm Brooks looked around the ballroom without saying a word as quiet laughter drifted across the round tables covered in white linen. Crystal glasses caught the warm light from the chandeliers above, and a jazz trio played softly near the stage as if nothing unusual had happened. Nearly every employee at Holbrook Technologies had turned to look at him. Some smiled politely. Others didn't even bother hiding their amusement. Malcolm simply rested one hand against the back of his chair and waited. The man who had asked the question still wore the same confident grin, completely certain he had won the room. Malcolm glanced toward his wife. Danielle Brooks lowered her eyes for only a second before forcing a nervous smile toward her coworkers. She did not defend him. She did not reach for his hand. She only adjusted the silver bracelet on her wrist and quietly looked away. The silence lasted no more than 3 seconds before someone near the entrance said, "Sir?" Malcolm slowly turned his head. Before anyone could see who had spoken, the story really began 12 hours earlier. Malcolm Brooks woke at 5:30 every weekday, without an alarm. 20 years of routine had trained his body better than any clock. He folded the blanket, straightened the pillows, and walked downstairs while the neighborhood outside remained wrapped in the gray light before sunrise. The coffee maker started with a familiar click. Fresh coffee filled the kitchen. Malcolm poured 2 mugs, placing one beside Danielle's usual seat before opening the refrigerator to prepare breakfast. Danielle entered the kitchen 15 minutes later wearing a navy business suit and scrolling through emails on her phone. "Morning," Malcolm said with an easy smile. "Morning," Danielle answered without looking up. She picked up the coffee, took one sip, then checked another message. "Tonight's dinner starts at 6:30. Please don't be late." Malcolm nodded. "I already cleared my schedule." "Good." She finally looked at him. "Almost everyone important will be there." Malcolm smiled again. "Then I'll make sure I stay out of everyone's way." Danielle forced a quick laugh, though it sounded more uncomfortable than amused. "Just let me handle most of the conversations, okay?" Malcolm studied her face for a moment before answering. "Whatever makes your evening easier." Danielle relaxed just enough to believe the conversation was over. She kissed his cheek, picked up her laptop bag, and hurried toward the front door. Malcolm watched through the kitchen window as she backed her SUV onto the street and disappeared around the corner. The house became quiet again. He rinsed the breakfast dishes, wiped the counter clean, and checked the time on the old stainless steel watch he had worn for years. His phone buzzed once on the kitchen island. A short message appeared across the screen. "Arrival confirmed for 7:15 p.m. The board will be ready." Malcolm read the message only once before locking the screen. He slipped the phone into his pocket, picked up his coffee mug, and looked out the window with the same calm expression he carried everywhere. By the time the company dinner began that evening, not a single person inside that ballroom would realize they were about to meet the most important guest of the night. Malcolm arrived at the Grand Crescent Hotel at exactly 6:20 in the evening. The valet greeted him with a practiced smile before taking the keys to his dark gray sedan. Malcolm thanked him, adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit, and walked toward the entrance without rushing. The ballroom occupied the entire second floor. Warm music floated through the hallway long before he reached the registration table. A company employee wearing a blue name badge smiled politely as she checked the guest list. "Good evening, sir." "Your name?" she asked. "Malcolm Brooks." She found the name almost immediately. "Welcome, Mr. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks is already inside." Malcolm thanked her and stepped into the ballroom. Nearly 200 guests filled the room. Conversations overlapped beneath soft jazz, while servers carried trays of sparkling water and appetizers between the tables. A large digital screen displayed the company logo beside the words "Annual Leadership Appreciation." "Dinner." Malcolm spotted Danielle across the room almost immediately. She stood with several department managers, laughing at something one of them had said. She looked confident, polished, and completely comfortable. Malcolm smiled as he walked toward her. Danielle noticed him when he was only a few steps away. Her smile faded for just a fraction of a second before returning. "You made it," she said. "I told you I would. Everyone is still networking. Dinner starts soon." Malcolm nodded. "Looks like a nice event." Before Danielle could answer, a tall man in an expensive navy suit approached with 2 other coworkers. "Danielle," he said with an easy grin. "You were right. Your husband actually came." Danielle forced another smile. "Malcolm," This is Brandon Cole. Brandon leads business development. Malcolm extended his hand. Nice to meet you. Brandon shook it quickly without much interest. Likewise. His eyes moved over Malcolm's simple watch, modest suit, and polished black shoes. So what line of work are you in? Consulting, Malcolm answered. That sounds broad. Malcolm smiled. Sometimes broad is enough. Brandon chuckled while the others exchanged amused looks. Fair enough. Another manager joined the circle carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. Danielle, your husband? Danielle nodded. Yes. Malcolm. The manager smiled politely before turning back toward Brandon as though the introduction had already ended. Malcolm noticed the shift, but said nothing. Danielle glanced around the room. I should introduce you to a few more people. They moved from one conversation to another. Malcolm shook hands, remembered names, and listened far more than he spoke. Several employees barely acknowledged him before steering the discussion back toward promotions, quarterly numbers, executive travel, and industry conferences. Malcolm remained relaxed through every exchange. He asked thoughtful questions. He complimented the event staff. He thanked each server who refilled his water glass. More than once he noticed people looking at him after learning he was Danielle's husband. Some seemed surprised. Others seemed quietly disappointed on Danielle's behalf. None of it changed Malcolm's expression. Near the center of the ballroom, a cluster of senior executives gathered near the stage. Malcolm recognized several faces immediately, though none appeared to recognize him. One executive checked his phone 3 times within a minute before whispering something to another member of the leadership team. Both glanced toward the entrance. Danielle followed their eyes. Everyone seems nervous tonight, Malcolm observed. There is a very important guest coming, Danielle replied. The chief executive officer has been talking about it all week. Malcolm looked toward the ballroom doors before taking a slow sip of water. I hope they make a good first impression. Danielle smiled faintly, missing the quiet confidence behind his words. Across the room, Brandon watched Malcolm over the rim of his glass. A slow grin spread across his face as though an idea had just occurred to him, and he began walking directly toward Malcolm once again. Brandon stopped beside Malcolm with the confidence of someone who believed every conversation belonged to him. 2 more coworkers drifted closer, followed by another manager balancing a plate of appetizers. Within seconds, what had started as a casual exchange became a small circle of curious faces. Brandon smiled as he adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket. Malcolm, I have been thinking about what you said earlier. Malcolm looked at him calmly. Which part? The consulting part. A few people chuckled before Brandon continued. That is still a pretty mysterious answer. Malcolm nodded. Sometimes my work is easier to explain after people see the results. Brandon laughed louder this time. That sounds important. Danielle forced a polite smile. Brandon. He lifted one hand. I am only making conversation. He turned back toward Malcolm. So tell us, do you consult for large companies? Occasionally. Technology? Sometimes. Finance. Malcolm took another sip of water before answering. When it is needed. Brandon looked around the group with an exaggerated expression. I think your husband has mastered the art of answering without answering. Several people laughed again. Malcolm simply smiled. One woman standing beside Danielle tilted her head. How long have you 2 been married? 9 years, Danielle answered. That is wonderful, the woman said before looking at Malcolm. It must be exciting watching Danielle's career take off. Malcolm nodded. I am proud of everything she has accomplished. Danielle thanked her quietly, but Brandon was not finished. He folded his arms and leaned against the edge of the table. You know what impresses me most about Danielle? He asked. Nobody answered. Brandon did not wait. She belongs in executive rooms. She thinks bigger than most people here. He looked directly at Malcolm. That kind of ambition usually needs a partner who can keep up. The laughter this time was softer, more uncomfortable. Malcolm met Brandon's eyes without changing his expression. People support each other in different ways. True, Brandon replied. Still, these dinners can be awkward. Malcolm waited. Brandon smiled even wider. You spend all evening listening to conversations about acquisitions, investments, leadership, and strategy while everyone else actually works in that world. Danielle shifted her weight. Brandon, dinner is about to start. One last question. Brandon lifted his glass. More heads slowly turned toward them. Even people at nearby tables had begun listening without pretending otherwise. Brandon looked at Malcolm with complete confidence. How does it feel? Malcolm did not answer immediately. Brandon continued before anyone else could speak. How does it feel sitting in a room full of people who built successful careers while knowing your wife is probably the most accomplished person in your household? The words settled over the table like heavy glass. Nobody laughed this time. A server carrying fresh bread slowed almost to a stop before quietly continuing toward another table. Danielle stared at the white tablecloth instead of her husband. She did not interrupt. She did not defend him. Malcolm rested his water glass on the table with careful precision. His fingers never shook. His breathing never changed. He looked around the circle, meeting one face after another. Some appeared embarrassed. Others seemed curious to see what he would do next. Malcolm finally smiled, not because he found the question amusing, but because he understood something the rest of the room did not. At that exact moment, the ballroom entrance opened again. 3 members of the executive leadership team stepped inside together, each scanning the room as though they were searching for one specific person. The conversation around the table faded into an uneasy silence. Brandon kept the same confident smile, convinced that Malcolm had no answer worth hearing. Danielle stood perfectly still beside her husband, holding the stem of her water glass so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. Malcolm looked at Brandon for another second before speaking in the same calm voice he had used all evening. Everyone measures success differently. Brandon shrugged. That sounds like something people say when they do not have a better answer. A few uncomfortable laughs drifted across the table. Malcolm did not react. Instead, he picked up his glass, took another slow sip of water, and set it back exactly where it had been before. His movements were steady enough that several people quietly exchanged puzzled looks. Most expected embarrassment. Some expected anger. Instead, Malcolm looked as though nothing important had happened. That unexpected calm seemed to frustrate Brandon even more. Come on, Brandon continued with a grin. Nobody is judging you. We are all just having fun. Malcolm nodded politely. Then I hope everyone enjoys the evening. Brandon blinked once, clearly disappointed that his words had failed to provoke any visible reaction. Before he could continue, a voice echoed from the front of the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, dinner service will begin in just a few minutes. Employees slowly returned toward their assigned tables while servers placed fresh bread, salads, and silverware in front of each guest. Malcolm pulled out Danielle's chair before taking his own seat beside her. She thanked him quietly without meeting his eyes. For nearly a minute, neither of them spoke. The music continued softly in the background while conversations slowly returned across the ballroom. Danielle finally leaned slightly toward Malcolm. I am sorry about Brandon, she whispered. Malcolm looked at her with the same gentle expression. There is nothing to apologize for. Danielle hesitated. He can be competitive. Malcolm smiled faintly. Competition usually says more about the competitor than the person standing across from him. Danielle wanted to answer, but another announcement interrupted the room. Near the entrance, the chief executive officer appeared beside several senior executives. Their relaxed expressions from earlier had disappeared. Each of them held a phone in one hand, while quietly exchanging short sentences that nobody else could hear. One executive checked his watch. Another looked toward the ballroom doors again. The chief executive officer spoke briefly with the hotel event manager before pointing toward the main entrance. Malcolm noticed every movement without appearing to pay attention. Danielle followed his gaze. They still look nervous, she said. Malcolm nodded once. Someone important must be running behind schedule. Danielle smiled. Whoever it is, the entire leadership team seems determined to impress them. Malcolm glanced at the old stainless steel watch on his wrist. It read 7:12. His phone vibrated once inside his jacket pocket. He did not remove it immediately. 3 quiet seconds passed before he reached inside, glanced at the screen beneath the table, and locked it again almost instantly. The message contained only 4 words. We have arrived downstairs. Malcolm slipped the phone back into his pocket without changing his expression. Across the ballroom, Brandon noticed the brief movement and smirked toward one of his coworkers. He whispered something that caused both of them to laugh under their breath. Danielle caught the exchange and looked away, clearly wishing the evening would simply move on. Malcolm folded his napkin neatly across his lap and looked toward the ballroom entrance once more. This time the hotel doors opened wider than before, and every member of the executive leadership team immediately turned in the same direction at exactly the same moment. The ballroom grew noticeably quieter even though the music never stopped. Conversations continued, but they became shorter, softer, interrupted by curious glances toward the entrance every few seconds. The chief executive officer remained near the front doors instead of taking his seat. Two members of the board stood beside him with the same patient but alert expressions. One of them checked his phone before nodding almost imperceptibly. Another adjusted his tie and spoke briefly into a wireless headset. Malcolm noticed every detail while calmly unfolding his dinner napkin. Across the table, Brandon leaned back in his chair with complete confidence. "Looks like somebody important finally decided to show up," he said loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. One manager nodded. "The rumor is that the company has been negotiating with a major investment group for months." Another employee joined the conversation. "I heard the deal could change everything." Brandon smiled. "If that is true, tonight is going to be memorable." Danielle looked toward the executives with growing curiosity. "Nobody in my department knows exactly who is coming," she admitted. "Even senior directors have been kept out of the loop." Malcolm reached for the basket of warm bread and placed one piece onto Danielle's plate before serving himself. "Sometimes confidentiality protects everyone involved," he said quietly. Danielle gave him a polite smile. "You always sound like you know more than everyone else." Malcolm returned the smile without answering. A server appeared beside the table carrying fresh glasses of iced tea. As she reached Malcolm, she paused for the briefest moment before politely saying, "Good evening, sir." Malcolm thanked her by name after reading the small embroidered tag on her uniform. "Thank you, Olivia." The young server looked pleasantly surprised that someone had noticed her name before continuing to the next table. Danielle watched the exchange. "You remember everyone's name." Malcolm shrugged gently. "People deserve to be seen." Before Danielle could respond, another vibration came from Malcolm's phone. This time he did not remove it immediately. He simply rested one hand against his jacket pocket, feeling the brief pulse before it stopped. Across the ballroom, the chief executive officer looked down at his own phone at almost the exact same moment. His expression changed instantly. He straightened his posture and looked toward the hotel entrance with visible relief. Every executive standing beside him followed his gaze. Brandon noticed the movement as well. "Showtime," he said with an excited grin. "Whoever this mystery guest is must have a very impressive ego if they are making the entire executive team wait." A few people laughed softly. Malcolm remained silent. He glanced once at the stainless steel watch on his wrist. 7:15 exactly. His calm expression never changed, but there was a quiet certainty in his eyes that had not been there earlier. Danielle noticed it this time. "You seem unusually relaxed," she said. Malcolm looked at her kindly. "There is no reason not to be." She studied him for another second, searching for something she could not quite explain. Before she could ask another question, the ballroom doors opened once again. Several hotel staff members stepped aside simultaneously. The chief executive officer immediately walked forward instead of waiting where he stood, and every member of the board followed him without hesitation. More than 200 guests instinctively turned toward the entrance. Forks paused above dinner plates. Conversation stopped in the middle of sentences. Brandon leaned slightly into the aisle for a better view, convinced that the most important person of the evening was finally about to appear, never realizing that the person everyone was waiting to greet was already seated only a few feet away from him. Every eye in the ballroom remained fixed on the entrance. The hotel doors stayed open as two attendants stepped politely to the side, creating a clear path into the room. The chief executive officer took another step forward, followed closely by every member of the board. Their expressions carried the same mixture of anticipation and respect. Guests whispered across the ballroom, each trying to guess the identity of the person who had delayed dinner by nearly 15 minutes. Brandon leaned back with a confident smile. "Whoever walks through that door must enjoy making an entrance." One of the managers laughed. "At least we will finally find out who has everyone so nervous." Danielle folded her hands together on the table. "I have never seen our executive team act like this before." Malcolm looked toward the entrance for only a moment before calmly unfolding his linen napkin once more. His attention seemed strangely divided between the room and the watch on his wrist. Danielle noticed the small movement again. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked quietly. Malcolm met her eyes with a relaxed smile. "You could say that." Before Danielle could ask another question, A hotel coordinator hurried toward the chief executive officer, holding a tablet. The two exchanged a few quiet words. The chief executive officer nodded once, glanced around the ballroom, then looked toward the entrance again with renewed confidence. Brandon noticed the exchange and chuckled. I bet they are rehearsing the welcome speech. Another coworker smiled. Maybe it is the head of the investment group. Brandon shrugged. Or maybe some billionaire who wants everyone to know he has arrived. Several people around the table laughed. Malcolm remained silent. A server approached carrying the first course. She politely asked whether anyone needed anything before dinner officially began. Malcolm thanked her and asked for another glass of water. His voice remained steady, almost as though the entire room had not been holding its breath for the past several minutes. Danielle watched him carefully. The calm she had dismissed earlier now felt almost unusual. It was not the calm of someone who felt out of place. It was the calm of someone who already knew how the evening would unfold. Across the ballroom, the chief executive officer suddenly straightened his jacket. Every board member instinctively did the same. The conversation stopped again without anyone asking for silence. Even the musicians lowered the volume until only the piano could barely be heard. Brandon smiled toward Malcolm with another playful look. Careful, he said. This is probably the closest either of us will ever get to someone. This important. Malcolm looked at him with the same polite expression. You never know who you might meet. Brandon laughed. That is optimistic. Malcolm simply nodded. Sometimes reality is more surprising than expectations. Brandon shook his head, convinced Malcolm was trying to sound wiser than he really was. Danielle looked from one man to the other, but said nothing. At that exact moment, a security representative entered through the ballroom doors and quietly scanned the room before stepping aside. Instead of announcing anyone, he nodded respectfully toward someone still standing outside. The chief executive officer immediately started walking forward. Every board member followed without hesitation. More than 200 guests instinctively rose from their chairs, believing the honored guest was finally about to enter. Brandon stood as well, smoothing the front of his jacket with a confident smile. Danielle rose beside him. Malcolm remained seated for one more calm second, reached for his water glass, and then quietly placed it back on the table just before a familiar voice from the entrance respectfully called out, "Good evening, Mr. Brooks. We are ready whenever you are." The words settled over the ballroom with the force of complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. More than 200 guests instinctively searched the room, trying to discover who the greeting had been meant for. Brandon turned toward the entrance with a confident smile, clearly expecting an important executive to step through the doors behind the security representative. Instead, the security representative remained where he was, standing respectfully beside the entrance with one hand extended toward the dining tables. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks," he repeated, his voice carrying easily across the quiet ballroom. "The board is ready whenever you are." Malcolm slowly lifted his eyes from the table. He gave a small, polite nod as though the greeting had been completely expected. Danielle stared at her husband without blinking. Brandon looked from Malcolm to the entrance, then back again, waiting for someone else named Brooks to stand up. Nobody did. Malcolm placed his linen napkin neatly beside his dinner plate before rising from his chair with the same calm composure he had shown throughout the evening. The chief executive officer immediately walked toward him. Every member of the board followed only a step behind. Their polished shoes crossed the ballroom floor, while every conversation remained frozen. Guests standing near the aisle instinctively stepped aside to create a clear path. Brandon's confident smile slowly disappeared. Danielle watched the executives approach her table, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Malcolm remained exactly where he was. He did not hurry toward them. He did not wave. He simply waited. The chief executive officer stopped directly in front of Malcolm before extending both hands with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Brooks," he said warmly, "thank you for joining us this evening. We sincerely appreciate your patience." Malcolm accepted the handshake with an easy smile. "Thank you for inviting me." The chief executive officer nodded. "The board has been looking forward to meeting you in person." One of the directors stepped forward carrying a slim leather portfolio. "We have prepared everything exactly as requested." Malcolm thanked him with a slight nod. Around the ballroom, stunned whispers spread from table to table. Employees who had barely acknowledged Malcolm only minutes earlier now looked at him as though they were seeing a completely different man. Danielle slowly covered her mouth with one hand. She remembered every conversation from the evening, every moment she had allowed Brandon to take control, every second she had remained silent. Brandon stood perfectly still beside his chair. His eyes moved from Malcolm to the chief executive officer and back again, searching for an explanation that refused to appear. Finally, he forced an uncertain laugh. "Wait, what is happening?" Nobody answered him. The chief executive officer turned toward the ballroom and addressed the room with a broad smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, before dinner officially begins, I would like to introduce someone whose partnership will shape the future of this company for many years to come." Every guest focused on Malcolm. The chief executive officer continued without hesitation. "Please welcome Mr. Malcolm Brooks, the managing partner representing the investment group that has completed our largest strategic agreement in company history." The words echoed through the ballroom like a sudden change in gravity. Faces that had shown amusement only moments earlier now reflected shock and disbelief. Brandon's shoulders stiffened. Danielle felt her breath catch as she looked at the man she thought she knew, realizing that the quiet husband she had underestimated had been the most important guest in the entire room from the very beginning. For several long seconds, nobody applauded because nobody knew how to react. The silence felt heavier than any speech. Brandon looked at Malcolm as though he had never seen him before. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Danielle remained frozen beside her chair, unable to reconcile the quiet man she had driven to the hotel with the respected executive now shaking hands with every member of the leadership team. The chief executive officer smiled toward the audience. "This partnership represents the most significant investment our company has ever received. We would not be celebrating tonight without Mr. Brooks and his team." A wave of applause finally spread across the ballroom. It began near the stage, then reached every table until the entire room echoed with respectful clapping. Malcolm acknowledged the applause with a small nod. He neither smiled broadly nor accepted the attention as though it belonged only to him. His calm demeanor remained exactly the same. One board member opened the leather portfolio and presented several documents for Malcolm to review before the formal announcement. Malcolm glanced through the pages with practiced efficiency, signed where indicated, and returned the portfolio with a simple thank you. Brandon swallowed hard. He quietly replayed every joke he had made that evening, every sarcastic remark, every unnecessary question. Each memory landed harder than the one before it. One of the managers who had laughed earlier slowly stepped toward Malcolm. "Mr. Brooks, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions before introducing myself properly." Malcolm offered a courteous handshake. "We all make assumptions sometimes. What matters is what we choose to do afterward." The manager nodded with visible relief. Another employee approached to congratulate him, followed by another, until a small line naturally formed around Malcolm. People who had barely acknowledged him less than an hour earlier now waited patiently for the opportunity to speak with him. Danielle watched the scene unfold without moving. She remembered asking Malcolm to let her handle the conversations because she believed he would not fit into her professional world. The memory stung far more than Brandon's remarks ever could. She finally stepped closer. "Malcolm," she said softly. He turned toward her with the same gentle expression he had worn all evening. "Yes." Danielle hesitated. "Why did you never tell me?" Malcolm answered honestly. "The agreement was confidential until tonight. I signed legal documents promising not to discuss it with anyone outside the transaction." Danielle lowered her eyes. "I thought." She stopped before finishing the sentence. Malcolm nodded gently. "I know what you thought." Before either of them could continue, Brandon slowly approached. The confidence that had defined him all evening had completely disappeared. His shoulders were lower. His voice was quieter. He looked directly at Malcolm. "I owe you an apology." Malcolm listened without interrupting. Brandon took a slow breath. "I judged you without knowing anything about you. I crossed a line, and I embarrassed myself more than I embarrassed you." Malcolm studied him for a moment before answering. Respect should never depend on someone's title, salary, or influence. If tonight teaches us anything, I hope it is that lesson. Brandon nodded once. He had no argument left. Around them, conversations had changed completely. Nobody discussed Malcolm's suit, his watch, or his career anymore. They spoke instead about his character, his humility, and the remarkable composure he had shown while every opportunity to defend himself had been placed directly in front of him. Danielle quietly realized that. The greatest difference between Malcolm and everyone else in the ballroom had never been his success. It had always been his dignity. The rest of the evening unfolded very differently from the way anyone in the ballroom had expected. Dinner was finally served, but the conversations no longer revolved around promotions, salaries, or office politics. Every table seemed to return to the same subject. People spoke quietly about Malcolm Brooks, not because of the investment agreement itself, but because of the remarkable restraint he had shown before anyone knew who he really was. The chief executive officer invited Malcolm to share a few words before dessert. Malcolm walked to the stage without hesitation, adjusted the microphone once, and looked across the room filled with familiar but noticeably changed faces. "Thank you for your warm welcome," he began. "Tonight has reminded me that business is built on numbers, contracts, and strategy, but lasting success is built on something much simpler. It is built on character. Every person who walks into a room deserves the same respect before you know their title as they do afterward. Titles change. Positions change. Markets change. Character is what remains when everything else is gone." The ballroom remained completely silent. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered. Malcolm continued with the same calm confidence. "Our investment group chose this company because we believed in its people and its future. I hope we build a culture where every employee, every guest, and every family member feels valued without needing to prove their worth first." When he finished, the applause began immediately. This time it was louder, longer, and far more genuine than before. Malcolm thanked the audience with a small nod before returning to his seat. As the evening came to an end, guests lined up to shake his hand. Brandon waited until nearly everyone else had left. When his turn finally came, he looked Malcolm directly in the eyes. "I will remember what you said tonight for the rest of my career." Malcolm accepted the handshake with the same quiet kindness he had offered everyone else. "Then tonight was worthwhile for both of us." Brandon nodded gratefully before walking away without another word. Outside the hotel, the cool evening air replaced the warmth of the crowded ballroom. The valet brought Malcolm's sedan to the entrance. Danielle stood beside the passenger door without speaking for several moments. Finally, she broke the silence. "I spent too much time worrying about what other people thought." Malcolm listened patiently. "I confused status with value. I let someone disrespect you, and I said nothing. I cannot change that, but I am truly sorry." Malcolm looked at the city lights stretching beyond the parking lot before answering. "Respect is not something another person can give me. It is something I choose to keep." Danielle lowered her eyes. Tears gathered, but Malcolm did not speak with anger or satisfaction. He simply opened the passenger door for her the same way he always had. Danielle quietly shook her head. "I think I should drive home alone tonight." Malcolm understood exactly what she meant. "All right." She thanked him softly before walking toward a rideshare waiting near the curb. Malcolm watched until the car disappeared into the evening traffic. He then climbed into his own sedan, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and sat quietly for a moment before starting the engine. He had not won because powerful people recognized his success. He had won because he never allowed another person's opinion to define his dignity. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving everyone else wrong. It is refusing to become someone different while they are busy misunderstanding who you have been all along.